The cattle were gone. The grain shed was half empty. 22 men hadn't eaten a real meal in 4 days, and Silas Rowan was standing in his own barn in the dead of October wondering if he'd made the worst decision of his life. Not the bad cattle deal from 2 summers ago, not the loans he couldn't repay, but the woman sitting alone at his kitchen table right now. A stranger, his wife of 6 hours. He didn't even know what she ate for breakfast. He didn't know if this was going to fix anything. He just knew he was out of other options. If you've ever watched something you built slowly fall apart and felt completely powerless to stop it, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Silas Rowan rode into Caldwell Creek to collect his new wife, the temperature had already dropped 12 degrees since sunrise, and the sky over the Clark Fork Valley had turned the color of old pewter. Not the dramatic, stormy kind of gray that at least gave you something to look at. Just flat, dull, indifferent gray. The kind of sky that didn't care what happened to you down below. He told himself the whole ride in that this was a business arrangement. Clean, simple, no different from buying a piece of equipment you needed to keep the operation running. That was the only way he could think about it without his chest tightening up. The woman waiting outside the Wells Fargo relay office didn't look the way he'd imagined her. He'd imagined someone larger, somehow. More obvious. What he found instead was a slight figure in a dark wool coat that had been mended at both elbows, standing with a single trunk and a canvas satchel at her feet, watching him ride up with an expression he couldn't read at all. She wasn't nervous exactly. She wasn't smiling either. She just looked like someone who had made a decision and was now waiting to see what came of it. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, climbing down from the horse. "Mr. Rowan?" Her voice was quieter than he expected. She offered her hand the way a man would, direct, no fuss. He shook it. He'd gotten the arrangements through a mutual contact in Missoula, a woman named Carver, who matched frontier families with practical situations. That was how she'd described it, practical situations. The advertisement Silas had submitted was 3 sentences long. He'd described the ranch, the acreage, the general condition of things. He had not, in those 3 sentences, mentioned how bad things actually were. Eloise Ashcroft had responded with a letter that was also short. She had practical household skills, she wrote. She was not afraid of hard work. She had no family remaining and no other prospects she was choosing to walk away from. She asked only that she be treated with basic decency. He'd thought, reading that letter, that it was a sad thing to ask for. He threw her trunk onto the back of the wagon, and they rode the 11 miles back to the ranch mostly in silence. He pointed out landmarks when they passed them. That ridge was the eastern boundary of his property. That creek feeding into the larger one was called Bitter Run because it ran alkaline half the year. And she looked where he pointed and nodded and didn't ask questions. He didn't know if that was a good quality or a troubling one. What he was not telling her as they rode through the yellowed grass and past the fence lines that needed repairing and past the pasture that should have had cattle in it but didn't, was that the ranch was 34 days away from the point where he would have no legal right to call it his anymore. He owed the Territorial Savings Association in Helena $1,100 in overdue mortgage payments. He owed a feed merchant in Deer Lodge another $240. There was the equipment note coming due in January that he had no plan for paying. His foreman, a stubborn, honest man named Dale Pruitt, had told him 3 weeks ago, standing in the barn doorway with his hat in his hands, that the men were starting to talk. Not in a mutinous way, just the quiet, defeated kind of talk that meant people were calculating how long they could afford to stay somewhere before they needed to find somewhere else. 22 men depended on this ranch for their wages and their winter shelter. 22 men, most of whom had nowhere else obvious to go before the cold set in. Silas hadn't slept more than 4 consecutive hours in 6 weeks. The marriage was not a romantic idea. He'd been honest with himself about that. What the ranch needed was an additional set of hands that didn't cost him monthly wages, someone who could manage the domestic end of things, so the men ate regularly, because hungry men worked slow and made mistakes and eventually walked. It was calculated. He knew it was calculated. He didn't feel great about it, but he also didn't have the luxury of feeling great about things right now. What he had not anticipated was that she would look at the property the way she did when they pulled up the long drive and the ranch house came into view. She went quiet in a different way than she'd been quiet during the ride. She sat up slightly and her eyes moved across the yard, the outbuildings, the condition of the fence near the barn, the state of the woodpile, with an expression he could only describe as focused, like she was reading something, like she was calculating. He didn't notice it at the time. He was already thinking about the conversation he needed to have with Pruitt before sundown. The ranch house was not what anyone would call welcoming. It was a two-story structure built by Silas's father in 1869. Solid enough bones, but badly in need of paint, and several window replacements that had been on the list for 2 years. The front room served as both sitting room and office. The kitchen was large and practical. There were 3 bedrooms upstairs, one of which had a broken floor joist that Silas had been stepping around since spring. He showed her around with the efficiency of a man showing someone a piece of equipment they'd be operating. Here is the kitchen. The wood supply is there. The well is 40 feet from the back door. The pump handle sticks in cold weather. You have to lift it slightly before you pull. He did not show her the ledger books. He did not explain the financial situation. He told himself that was because there was no point overwhelming her on the first day. The truth, if he was being honest with himself, was that he was ashamed of it. "The men take their meals in the bunkhouse," he said. "There's a stove there. They've been managing their own cooking, but it's been—" He paused. "Rough." "How many men?" she asked. 22, counting Pruitt. He's foreman. You'll meet him." She nodded. "I'll need to know what's available in the larder," she said. It wasn't a complaint, just information she required. What was available in the larder was not impressive. 2 sides of aging beef, some salt pork that had been there since August, a depleted sack of cornmeal, dried beans, and a small wheel of hard cheese. She stood in the larder doorway for a moment, looking at it. He watched her face, looking for the reaction. Dismay, maybe, or the careful blankness of someone trying to hide dismay. But she just looked at it, moved a few things, looked at the underside of one of the beef sides, and walked back out. "I can work with this," she said. He didn't know whether to be relieved or more worried. Dale Pruitt was 51 years old and had the face of a man who had spent most of those years outdoors. He was leather tough and plain-spoken and had worked for Silas's father before he'd worked for Silas, which gave him the kind of institutional authority that didn't come from title. He ran the men fairly. He told the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. Silas trusted him more than almost anyone he'd ever known. When Silas introduced Elowin to Pruitt that afternoon in the yard between the barn and the bunkhouse, Pruitt took off his hat, shook her hand, and said, "Ma'am," in a neutral tone that was not unfriendly, but was not particularly warm either. He glanced at Silas briefly with an expression that said, quite clearly, "This is not going to fix the actual problem." Silas gave him a look back that said, "I know that. I know." The men Elowin met that first afternoon were similarly reserved. Not rude. Silas ran a ranch that didn't tolerate rudeness, but wary. She was an unknown variable in an already strained situation, and frontier men who were exhausted and underfed and worried about their winter circumstances did not have much bandwidth for warmly welcoming strangers. A few of them nodded. One young one, a kid named Everett, who couldn't have been older than 19, actually said hello like he meant it. Elowin didn't seem rattled by any of it. She said good afternoon to each of them and then went back to the kitchen, and Silas watched the men watch her go, and he heard one of the older ones, a man named Hogue, mutter something to the man next to him. He didn't catch the words, but he caught the tone, and it was not optimistic. That evening she made a meal out of the salt pork and the dried beans and the cornmeal, a thick, heavily seasoned stew that wasn't elegant, but was hot and filling, which was more than the men had had in several days. Silas heard from Pruitt the next morning that the men had eaten it without complaint. Coming from that particular group of men in that particular state, that was close to a standing ovation. He told himself that was something. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The first 2 weeks had a routine to them. Silas was out before light, working alongside the men on the maintenance and repair tasks that had piled up over the summer. Fence lines, the barn roof section that had started to leak, clearing a deadfall from the upper pasture road. There was always work on a ranch. Even a failing ranch had more work than hands to do it. The difference was that the work on a failing ranch felt like bailing water out of a sinking boat, necessary but not quite sufficient. He came back in at midday, and again at dark, ate what Elowin had prepared, and exchanged the minimal conversation required of 2 people sharing a house who did not yet know each other. She asked practical questions. How many men were on which work crew? whether there was a schedule for the coming week, what the state of the upper pasture road was after the clearing. He answered them. He did not ask what she was actually trying to figure out with these questions, because he told himself it didn't matter. He didn't notice right away that she was walking the property, not in a wandering way, not like she had nothing else to do. She was methodical about it. She went in different directions on different days, always when the kitchen work was done, always when she thought no one would particularly mark it. She carried a small notebook. He saw it tucked under her arm once when she came in from outside. Her boots carrying a different kind of mud than the yard mud, suggesting she'd been somewhere beyond the immediate buildings. He didn't ask about it. He had enough to think about. It was on a Thursday, 16 days after her arrival, that she found the smokehouse. She almost didn't. It was set back behind the grain shed at an angle that meant you couldn't see it at all from the main yard, half buried under a decade of climbing shrub and overgrown grass that had been left to do whatever it wanted. The structure itself was small, maybe 12 feet square, built from stone and heavy timber, the kind of construction that was meant to last and had. The door was warped in its frame. The interior, when she worked it open and stepped inside, smelled of earth and old char and something else underneath. The ghost of wood smoke so deeply absorbed into the stone walls that it had essentially become part of them. She stood in the dim interior for a long time. There was an iron rack suspended from the ceiling, solid and intact. The fire pit in the floor was filled with old ash. The draft vents cut into the upper walls were designed with a precision she recognized immediately. This was not a rough frontier construction. Someone had known exactly what they were doing when they built this. She crouched down and examined the fire pit, brushing away the top layer of ash. The stone beneath was in good condition. The whole structure was in better condition than anything else on the property. It had been built to last, and it had lasted quietly through years of neglect, waiting. She sat back on her heels in the dim light and thought about what she had in her canvas satchel, back in the bedroom upstairs. The ledger. Her father's ledger. The one he'd kept in the careful, cramped handwriting he'd developed over 30 years of working smoke cures all over the Pennsylvania and Ohio territories, before illness took everything else from him. He'd left her two things when he died, that ledger and the knowledge of how to use what was in it. She thought about what she'd seen of the larder, the beef sides, the state of the salt pork, the quantities available, and the rate at which 22 hungry men went through protein in a month. She thought about what she'd overheard, the previous evening, two of the men talking quietly near the well before they thought anyone was close enough to hear. One of them saying he'd been looking at work availability in Butte, the other one not disagreeing with that. She thought about Silas Rowan's face at dinner, the way he ate without tasting anything, looking at a point somewhere past his plate, doing math in his head that apparently wasn't adding up. She stood up, brushed the ash dust off her hands, and walked back to the house. She did not tell him about the smokehouse that evening. She wasn't ready to. She needed to know first whether her idea was as possible as it felt in that moment of standing in the old building, or whether she was constructing something out of hope and desperation that wouldn't survive contact with reality. She'd learned from her father that the gap between a good idea and a working idea was always wider than it looked from the outside. What she did do was get her father's ledger from the satchel and spread it open on the small table in the bedroom after supper, in the lantern light, and read it the way she'd read it dozens of times before. Not searching for anything new in it, she knew it well enough that she could have recited long sections from memory. She was confirming, checking her own recollections against the precise notations her father had made over 30 years. Wood varieties and burn rates, salt ratios for different meat thicknesses, temperature management through draft adjustment, timing for different cure depths. She had everything she needed in that book and in her own head. The question was whether she had everything she needed on the property. The next morning, she made a quiet inventory. She did it between the breakfast preparation and the midday meal, moving through the grain shed and the storage barn and the tack room, checking what wood supplies existed and in what quantities, what salt stocks were on hand, what tools were available. She did it without asking anyone for anything, without explaining herself, writing notes in her own small notebook as she went. By afternoon, she had her answer. It was not quite enough. It was also not impossibly far from enough. That evening, she asked Silas, while he was reviewing papers at the desk in the front room, if she could speak with him about something. He looked up. There was that expression again, the one she'd come to recognize as his baseline for the past 2 weeks, a kind of contained exhaustion, like a man bracing for the next thing to go wrong. "Go ahead," he said. She sat down across from him without waiting to be asked. She'd brought her notebook. "I found a structure behind the grain shed," she said. "A smokehouse. Stone construction, iron rack, intact venting. It's been abandoned, but the structure is sound." He stared at her. "I know about the smokehouse." "Do you know it could be operational?" "It hasn't been used in—" He stopped. "My father used it. Before my time, mostly." "I want to restore it," she said. "And I want to use it." He leaned back in his chair slightly. The look on his face was not hostile. It was something more careful than that. The look of a man who has already had too many plans not work out and has therefore become cautious about the beginning stages of new ones. "For what purpose?" he said. "Cured meat," she said. "Smoke cured. I know the process. My father taught me. He spent 30 years developing and perfecting cure methods for commercial and household use. I have his working ledger with me. The beef we have, properly cured and preserved, extends its shelf life from weeks to months. The salt pork already in storage can be better conditioned. We can purchase additional stock, process it here, and—" "We don't have the money to purchase additional stock," he said. Flat. Not unkind, just flat. "I know," she said. "That's the second part. A smoke-cured product has commercial value. Preserved meat is a necessity out here before winter. Other ranches, provisioning operations, wagon train suppliers, they need it. If the first runs are successful, we sell a portion of the output. The income from that allows us to purchase more raw stock. The operation becomes self-sustaining." Silence. He looked at her for a moment that was long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he looked at the notebook she'd placed on the desk between them, and she watched him calculate. She could almost see it happening behind his eyes. Weighing this against everything else he was weighing, finding the spot where it fit, or didn't. "What do you need to get started?" he said. "Access to the smokehouse for inspection and cleaning. 3 days of carpentry work from one of the men. There's nothing that requires expertise, just the door reframing and reinforcing the interior ash bench. 200 pounds of rock salt beyond what's currently in storage. Hickory or apple wood for the initial burns. The grain shed has some seasoned oak that will work as a substitute, and your permission. The men's time comes out of the regular work schedule," he said. "I can't take people off fence repair and barn maintenance for the younger one, Everett." He paused. "He's not experienced in carpentry. He doesn't need to be. I can direct him. I don't need skill. I need someone who can lift things and follow instructions." Another pause. He looked at the papers on the desk. The ones she could see were clearly financial in nature, columns of figures that weren't telling a cheerful story. "The rock salt," he said. "I know it's an expenditure. How much would an initial run of products sell for, if you could sell it?" She opened her notebook to a specific page. "Based on current frontier provision prices and the quantities we could process with the equipment available, a first run of approximately 300 pounds of finished cured product would sell for between $60 and $80 at market rate. A conservative estimate." He went very still. She'd done her homework carefully. She hadn't inflated the numbers to make the idea sound better than it was. That had been her father's rule. Always use the conservative estimate, because reality tends to find the low end of your projections. "How long to get to that first run?" he said. 3 weeks? Possibly 4? He looked at his papers. She waited. "The salt," he finally said. "I can authorize the salt." "That's enough to start," she said. He nodded once, slowly. He didn't say anything else. She picked up her notebook and left him to his papers. The smokehouse restoration took 11 days, not 3. This was partly because Everett, for all his willingness, had to be taught nearly everything from the beginning. How to assess whether a timber was structurally compromised, how to pack a door frame so it sealed without binding, how to mix the ash and clay compound that would seal the draft vent surrounds. He was not stupid. He was just 19 and had no experience with this kind of work. Elowen had not anticipated how much of her time would go into teaching rather than doing. But there was something about his earnestness that she found herself unable to be impatient with. He asked questions constantly. Why this wood and not that one? Why the vent had to be positioned at this exact height and not 6 inches higher? And he actually listened to the answers. He didn't just want to finish the task. He wanted to understand it. Your father did this? He asked her on the fifth day, the two of them resealing the interior stone with a compound she'd mixed herself. The smokehouse smelled cleaner now, less of old abandonment and more of the stone and clay they were working with. Every day of his working life, she said, from the time he was younger than you are until he couldn't anymore. Where'd he learn it? From his father, and his grandfather before that, and from a man named Jeremiah Skolt, who ran a provision operation in eastern Ohio, and taught my father more about meat chemistry than anyone else ever did. Meat chemistry, Everett said, like the phrase was new to him. Smoke curing isn't just preserving, she said. It's a chemical process. The smoke compounds penetrate the protein structure. The salt draws out moisture and inhibits bacterial growth. Temperature and time determine how deep the cure goes. If you do it wrong, you waste the meat. If you do it right, you have something that'll last a Montana winter. He turned this over. How'd you learn all of it? Your father teach you too? She was quiet for a moment. He didn't have a son, she said. And he didn't believe knowledge should sit unused because the person in the room didn't happen to be male. Everett nodded at this like it made complete sense to him, which she suspected said something decent about his upbringing. The other men mostly watched from a distance. Pruitt came by twice, ostensibly to check on Everett's absence from his regular duties, but actually, she thought, to see what she was doing. He stood in the doorway the second time and looked around the interior with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "It'll work?" he said. "Yes," she said, without hesitation. He chewed on something for a moment. "Silas's father used to run cures out of here," he said, long time ago. Before things... He stopped. Before the hard years. What happened to it? Pruitt shrugged. Nothing happened to it, nobody happened to it. Things got busy in other directions, then got bad, and nobody thought about this building anymore. He looked around one more time. Silas grew up eating off what came out of this place. Might be why he didn't fight you on the idea. She hadn't known that. The first burn happened on a Wednesday morning in early November, 3 days before the first real freeze of the season hit the Clark Fork Valley. She'd prepared the first batch herself the night before, working in the kitchen until well past midnight to get the salt cure applied and the meat properly conditioned for hanging. The cuts weren't perfect. She was working with what the ranch had on hand rather than what she'd have chosen. But she knew the process well enough to work around the imperfections in the raw material. The hickory she'd found in the supply inventory was limited, so she'd supplemented with the seasoned oak and a small quantity of dried applewood she'd located in a corner of the grain shed, probably forgotten by whoever had used it last. The blend wasn't her first choice, but it would give the product a distinctive flavor profile that the straight hickory wouldn't have, something she filed away as potentially useful information. She lit the fire pit at 6 in the morning and spent the first 2 hours managing the burn carefully, adjusting the draft vents to achieve and maintain the temperature range her father's ledger specified. It required constant attention. This was the part that couldn't be automated or approximated. You had to be present and watching and making small adjustments continuously, because the difference between a proper smoke temperature and one that was running too hot or too cool wasn't always visually obvious. You had to learn to read the smoke itself. By mid-morning, the men going about their work in the yard could see it, the slow, steady column of pale smoke rising from behind the grain shed. She heard them stopping, heard voices, not close enough to make out words. She was focused on the draft vent adjustment and didn't look up. At some point, Silas appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment, watching. "How's it going?" he said. "Ask me in 8 hours," she said. He left without saying anything else. What came off those racks 18 hours later was not the product of luck. It was the product of 30 years of accumulated knowledge from a dead man's careful handwriting, and the disciplined attention of a woman who had been learning that knowledge since she was old enough to stand in a smoke shed without coughing. The color was right, that deep mahogany that meant the cure had penetrated properly. The surface was firm without being brittle. When she cut into the first piece to check, the interior showed the ring of cure she was looking for, exactly as deep as it should be. She stood in the cooling smokehouse with the cut piece in her hand and allowed herself, very briefly, to feel the particular satisfaction of something going exactly right. Then she cleaned up, wrapped the finished product, and went to tell Silas it was done. She brought him a piece to taste, which was apparently not something he'd expected. He looked at the cut she placed on the table in front of him like he wasn't sure of the protocol. "You eat it," she said. He picked it up. He ate it. She watched his face. He chewed slowly. His expression shifted through several things she couldn't quite name before settling on something that wasn't exactly surprise but was adjacent to it. The look of someone encountering something better than their expectation and not quite knowing how to account for that. "That's," he started. "Good," she said, not as a question. "Yes." He looked at the rest of the piece in his hand. "That's genuinely good." She sat down across from him. "I need to speak to you about the next steps," she said. "To move from a first run to a regular production, I need to expand the raw stock. There's a cattle operation on the far side of the valley. I've heard the men mention it. A man named Torval, who sometimes sells directly. If you can make contact with him, we need to discuss a regular purchase arrangement." He looked up from the meat. "You're moving fast." "The freeze is coming," she said. "The ideal curing window is the weeks before it gets too cold for the smoke temperature management to work correctly. If we miss November, we lose the best production months until spring." He didn't argue with the logic. She'd noticed this about him, that when she presented information clearly and backed it with reasoning, he processed it rather than dismissing it. She didn't know whether that was his character or whether it was specific to his current situation of desperation, but she appreciated it either way. "Torval," he said, trying the name. "How do you know about Torval?" "Everett mentioned him. He said Torval has a reputation for fair pricing on direct sales." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I'll go see him," he said. "Day after tomorrow." She nodded, started to stand. "Elowin." She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She wasn't sure he'd used it at all since the wedding ceremony. It's good work," he said. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. He was looking at the table. "What you did?" "It's a first run," she said. "We'll know more from the second one." She went back to the kitchen, but she stood at the counter for a moment after she got there, not doing anything in particular, not celebrating, just sitting with the fact that something had worked, that something, for the first time in a while, had worked. Outside, the first flakes of early November snow were beginning to fall across the Clark Fork Valley, and from behind the grain shed, the smokehouse sat quiet and cooling in the fading afternoon light, its stone walls still warm from the fire, waiting to be lit again. The second run was harder than the first. That was the part nobody told you about doing something well the first time. It raised the standard. Elowin knew this going in, but knowing it and living through it were different things. The first run had been about proving the concept. The second run was about proving it wasn't a fluke. And those were two entirely different kinds of pressure. She'd also taken on more volume. Silas had come back from his visit to Torval's operation with a purchase agreement for an additional quarter side of beef and 2 full hog carcasses, which was more raw material than she'd had for the first run and required more precise management across a longer burn cycle. The smokehouse, for all that it had held up well in restoration, was still a building that had been sitting unused for the better part of a decade. She was learning its particular behaviors, the way the north vent ran slightly faster than the south one in strong wind, the way the fire pit's back corner burned hotter than the front, and learning them in real time during production, which was not ideal. Everett helped her again. She hadn't asked him specifically. She'd simply gone out to the smokehouse on the first morning of the second run and found him already there, having apparently decided on his own that this was where he was needed. "Pruitt know you're here?" she asked. "Pruitt told me to come," Everett said, in the slightly defensive tone of someone who had anticipated the question. She looked at him for a moment, then went back to checking the fire pit. She wasn't going to make a thing of it. The second run took 22 hours instead of 18. The hog took longer than the beef and required a different temperature profile. And at one point, around 2 in the morning, she'd had to wake Everett, who had fallen asleep sitting against the exterior stone wall with his coat pulled around him, because the south vent needed adjusting, and she needed a second set of hands to hold the rack steady while she did it. He came awake without complaint, which she filed away as a thing worth noting. The finished product was better than the first run. Not dramatically. The difference wasn't the kind of thing an untrained eye would catch, but she could see it in the color consistency and feel it in the texture, and her father had taught her that improvement in craft was usually incremental rather than sudden, and that incremental improvement was how you knew the process was taking hold rather than you just getting lucky. She told Silas this when she reported the results, and he nodded in the way he nodded when he was thinking about something else simultaneously. She was getting used to that. "I want to show you the numbers," she said. "Later this evening," he said. He was on his way out to the north pasture to deal with a fence section that had finally given up entirely in the overnight freeze. "This evening," she confirmed. He went. She went back to the smokehouse to begin the wrapping and storage process. The numbers, when she laid them out for him that evening at the kitchen table, told a story he hadn't expected. She'd kept meticulous records from the first run: inputs, processing time, finished weight, estimated market value based on the current provision prices she'd gotten Everett to quietly inquire about in town during a supply run. The second run's numbers were now added alongside. 2 runs. 41 days since her arrival. The finished product sitting in cold storage in the grain shed represented, at current market prices, slightly more than $130 in sellable goods. He sat with that figure for a while. $130 didn't erase what he owed the Territorial Savings Association. It didn't come close, but it was real money that hadn't existed 6 weeks ago, and it had come from materials largely already on the property, plus a controlled investment that had returned its cost several times over. "The third run," she said. She had her notebook open on the table. "If I can get the additional stock from Torval, I've calculated what we need. And if the burn goes as the second one did, the finished output should be in the range of 90 to 100 pounds of product above what we need for ranch consumption through December." 90 to 100 pounds, he said. "At market provision rate, that's between $80 and $90. He looked at her. "You're talking about selling it." "That's been the plan since the beginning," she said, and her voice stayed level, but there was something in it, a slight tightening, that told him she hadn't missed the fact that he was saying this like it was a new development. "I know that," he said. Selling it means actually going somewhere and selling it. I don't have time to make supply runs right now." "You don't need to," she said. "Everett can take a wagon load to the provisions merchant in Deer Lodge. I've already spoken with him about the route and the timing." He looked up. "You spoke with Everett about making a supply run?" "Yes." "Without speaking to me first." She held his gaze. "I spoke with him about whether the route was feasible and whether he knew the provisions merchant in Deer Lodge. I haven't given him any instructions or sent him anywhere. That requires your authorization, which is why I'm telling you now." The distinction was a careful one, and they both knew it. He let it go. "Fine," he said. "If the third run comes out the way you're projecting, we send Everett with a wagon load. I'll write him a letter of introduction for the merchant." She nodded, started to close the notebook. "How long can you keep this up?" he said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The hours. You're up before anyone else, and you're not stopping until after dark. Every day." "I'm managing." "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up and was pushing against the kitchen window in the particular persistent way it did in November on the Clark Fork, like it had a schedule to keep. "I'm doing what the work requires," she said. "It won't always require this much. Once the process is established and there are enough runs completed that the variables are predictable, the labor intensity decreases. Right now it requires more because we're still learning the equipment." "We," he said. "Everett and I," she said. Flat. Not an apology. He looked at the table. I'm not complaining about the hours, or about Everett." He seemed like he was trying to find something. "I just want to make sure you're not running yourself into the ground." "I'll tell you if I am," she said. He wasn't sure he believed that, but he didn't push it. The men's relationship with the smokehouse was not simple, and it shifted in stages rather than all at once. The first stage had been skepticism, which she'd expected. These were men who measured the value of work in visible physical terms. Fences repaired, animals fed, loads moved. A woman spending long hours in a small stone building doing something that didn't look like recognizable ranch labor was, from their vantage point, a suspicious use of time and resources. The second stage arrived with the meals. She had started from the third week onward, incorporating the cured product into the ranch meals, sliced thin and pan-cured with the beans, or chunked into the morning hash, or served alongside the cornbread in the evenings. The difference in the men's energy was not subtle. They'd been operating for months on food that kept them alive without particularly sustaining them, And the quality of protein they were getting now, dense and calorie-rich from the curing process, started showing up in their work output in ways that even Pruitt noticed. He didn't say anything to Elowen directly about this. He wasn't that kind of man. But she overheard him one morning near the bunkhouse, telling two of the older ranch hands that they were going to be on barn repair today, and he expected the east section done by midday. And the easy confidence in his voice when he said it, the absence of the careful hedging she'd heard in it earlier in the fall, told her something had shifted. Wag, the one who'd muttered something skeptical on her first day, was the most stubborn holdout. He was a large, weathered man of about 50 who had strong opinions about how things should be done and minimal interest in changing them. He wasn't vicious about it. He was just the kind of man who planted himself and waited to be convinced, and convincing him was a process that didn't respond to argument. It responded to time and evidence. The evidence arrived in the form of a bad morning in the third week of November. Elowen had gone out to the smokehouse before 6 to check on the current run, and she'd found that something, a wind gust most likely, or a slight ground shift, had disturbed the door ceiling overnight. Not catastrophically, but enough that the smoke had been running uneven on one side of the rack for several hours, and the cuts hanging on that side would need to be checked carefully. She was already inside assessing the damage when she heard boots on the frozen ground outside, and Hogue appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 lengths of rope and a pry tool, looking like he'd just happened to be passing. He wasn't just passing. They both knew it. He looked at the door, at the gap where the ceiling had shifted, and he didn't say anything. He just moved past her to the door frame, examined it for a moment, and then started working. He knew what he was doing. She could see that immediately. He had the hands and the instincts of someone who had been repairing structures for decades. She went back to the rack. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Left side," he said, eventually, without turning around. "The lower 2 cuts," she said. "I need to check them." He grunted, kept working. The door seal was repaired in about 40 minutes. He did it with the efficient, unfussy quality of someone who didn't need praise or conversation to get through a task. When he was done, he collected his tools and stepped back, tested the door twice, and nodded once at the result. "Ought to hold better now," he said. "Thank you," she said. He looked at the hanging cuts, not at her. "What's the difference on the ones that got the wrong smoke?" She explained it. What uneven smoke penetration did to the cure profile, what signs to look for, how to assess whether a cut was salvageable or had to be downgraded. He listened with the focused, absorptive attention of a man who retained what he heard. Then he nodded again and went back out into the cold. He didn't stop being Hogue. He didn't become warm or talkative or particularly demonstrative. But from that morning onward, the muttering stopped. Toot. Everett made the first supply run to Deer Lodge on a Thursday, loading a wagon before dawn with 62 pounds of the finished, cured product wrapped in cloth and packed in wooden boxes, carrying Silas's letter of introduction to a provisions merchant named Aldous Webb. He came back in the early evening with the boxes empty and a leather pouch containing $51.30. Elowen was in the kitchen when he came in. He held out the pouch, and his expression was the expression of someone who has discovered that a thing that sounded improbable has turned out to be entirely real. "He bought all of it," Everett said. "Every piece." He asked where it came from. "What did you tell him?" "Told him Rowan Ranch, Clark Fork Valley." He wrote it down. He paused. He asked if there was more. "There will be," she said. She took the pouch and went to find Silas. He was in the front room going over the mortgage correspondence again. She could tell by the set of his shoulders before she even came around far enough to see the papers. He had a particular stillness when he was dealing with those documents, the stillness of someone reading something unpleasant slowly enough to make sure he hadn't missed anything. She set the pouch on the desk. He looked at it, then at her. $51, she said. "First commercial sale. Webb and Deer Lodge bought the entire shipment and asked about ongoing supply." He didn't say anything. He picked up the pouch, felt the weight of it, set it back down. "The fourth run is already started," she said. "At the same output level as the third, we should have another 70 to 80 pounds ready to ship within 10 days. If Webb is consistent and we can add a second buyer, there's a provisioning operation in Missoula that Everett mentioned. We're looking at a regular monthly income from this operation alone." Silas was looking at the pouch, not at the papers. The pouch. How much time left on the mortgage notice? She asked. She'd seen the letters often enough in passing that she knew they existed. She didn't know the number. He looked up at her sharply. Just for a second, something crossed his face. Not anger, but something close to the reflex of it, the instinct to say that was not her concern. He didn't say it. 31 days, he said. To the full amount? To a payment sufficient to stop the foreclosure proceedings. He paused. $400. She nodded slowly. $400 in 31 days was not achievable through the Smokehouse alone at current production levels. She was not going to pretend otherwise, but it changed the shape of the problem. What other options are available to you? She said. He looked at her like the question surprised him slightly, like he hadn't expected her to engage with it on those terms. There's a man in Helena, he said, after a moment. Territorial banking. He's offered a restructure before. I didn't take it because the terms... He stopped. The terms would have meant giving up equity in the property. Would he restructure again? I don't know. Would it be worth finding out? He was quiet for a long moment. The wind was at the window again. The lamp on the desk threw everything into the kind of light that made a room feel smaller and more enclosed than it actually was. I'll write to him, Silas said. It wasn't a resolution. She wasn't going to pretend it was, but it was a next step where before there had been no next steps. And in her experience, that was the only thing next steps needed to be. The fourth run went cleanly. 83 pounds of finished product, the best color and consistency she'd achieved yet. The fire pit behaved exactly as she expected now, and she'd worked out a reliable method for compensating for the north vent's tendency to run fast in wind by adjusting the corresponding floor vent in the opposite corner. Small things. The kind of calibrations that accumulated into mastery over time. Hogue had begun appearing at the Smokehouse intermittently during his off hours. He never announced himself, and he never asked to be given work. He simply showed up and found things that needed doing, refilling the wood supply, reinforcing a shelf bracket that had been pulling slightly from the wall, and did them without comment. She stopped being surprised by it after the third time and started simply incorporating him into her working rhythm. He and Everett had a functional, mostly silent partnership that seemed to suit both of them. The ranch was not fixed. She was not going to pretend the ranch was fixed. The debt was still real, and the mortgage notice was still real, and the January equipment payment was still coming regardless of how many pounds of cured pork they shipped to Aldous Webb in Deer Lodge. But something had changed in the way the property felt. Not dramatically. Not in a way you could point to and say that thing is different now. It was more that the quality of the air had changed somehow, the weight of it. The men worked harder, not because anyone had asked them to, but because they were eating properly and sleeping better and had stopped calculating in the back of their minds how quickly they'd need to leave. Pruitt found her one evening as she was closing up the Smokehouse for the night. He stood just outside the door, hands in his coat pockets, and he had the air of someone who had been considering saying something for a while and had finally gotten around to it. "The men are different," he said. "I know," she said. "Silas is different." She considered this. He's less worried than he was 6 weeks ago. The worry is still there, it's just smaller. Pruitt nodded. He looked at the Smokehouse, at the stone walls, the repaired doorframe, the faint residual warmth still coming off it. His father used to say this place had more potential than anything else on the property. Used to say the whole ranch could run off what came out of this building if you did it right. His father was right, she said. Pruitt looked at her for a moment. His face was the face of a man who did not say things he didn't mean, and had been in enough hard situations to know the difference between someone who was performing competence and someone who actually possessed it. "Yes," he said. "I suppose he was." He went back toward the bunkhouse. She closed the Smokehouse door, checked the latch, and stood in the dark for a moment, the cold air off the Clark Fork working through her coat. 31 days on the mortgage. $51 in the pouch on Silas's desk. 83 more pounds of product waiting in cold storage. The numbers still didn't add up cleanly. They probably wouldn't, not all the way, not in 31 days. But the direction had changed, and on a failing ranch in November, in the Clark Fork Valley of Montana, with the winter settling in hard around everything, direction was not nothing. Direction was, in fact, a great deal. She went inside. The letter from Helena arrived on a Monday, 9 days after Silas had sent his own. Elowen knew it had come before Silas said anything about it, because she saw Everett ride in from town with the mail satchel and watched Silas meet him in the yard and take one envelope separately from the rest, holding it in a way that was slightly different from how he held ordinary correspondence. He stood in the cold for a moment looking at it, then went inside without opening it immediately, which told her the answer was probably not good. She was right. He told her that evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter flattened in front of him and his expression arranged into the careful neutrality he used when he was managing something he didn't want to show. Carver declined the restructure, he said, Carver being the Helena banking man. He says the property's current debt-to-asset ratio doesn't support renegotiation. He'd need a demonstrated income stream and collateral beyond the land itself before he'd consider reopening the terms. She sat down. A demonstrated income stream. Something on paper, documented, a contract, he said, or a formal supply arrangement with a verified buyer. She was quiet for a moment. Aldous Webb in Deer Lodge. Webb bought 2 shipments from us. That's not a contract. That's a man who bought something twice. It could become a contract. It could, he said, but getting Webb to sign a formal supply agreement takes time, and time is, he looked at the letter, 22 days. 22 days to the mortgage payment deadline. She turned this over. The Smokehouse had now completed 4 runs. The cold storage in the grain shed held product from the last 2, because the 4th run had produced more than Everett had been able to move on the last Deer Lodge trip. Webb had taken 60 pounds of it, but declined the remainder, not because the quality was poor, but because he had limited cold storage of his own and couldn't move the volume fast enough before it went beyond its sell-by window. That was a problem she'd been thinking about. Webb was one buyer with one storage constraint. A single buyer arrangement was inherently fragile. If Webb won't sign a contract at the volume we need, she said slowly, there has to be someone who will. Someone with larger storage capacity and a more consistent need. Silas looked at her. The provisioning operation in Missoula that Everett mentioned. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks, she said. I didn't bring it up earlier because Webb seemed sufficient. He isn't. Missoula is 60 miles. I know that. Everett can't make that run and be back in a day. It's an overnight trip at minimum, more likely 2. I know that too, she said. I'm not suggesting Everett makes it. He understood what she was suggesting. She watched him work through it. The calculation of what the ranch needed versus what he could afford to take himself away from for 2 days. The fence lines were holding, mostly. The barn roof section had been completed. The worst of the urgent maintenance was done. If I go to Missoula, he said, I need something to show them. Not just samples. Something that tells them this is a reliable operation. I've been keeping records of every run, she said. Inputs, processing time, finished yield, quality assessments. 4 runs of consistent data. She got up, went to the bedroom, came back with her notebook and the supplementary record sheets she'd been keeping separately. She put them on the table in front of him. Take these. He looked at the records. She'd organized them clearly, not in a way that was showing off, just in a way that made the information immediately readable. Date of run, raw material input, processing hours, finished weight, quality grade, sale price achieved. He picked up the sheets and read through them. She waited. This is thorough, he said. My father kept records the same way. He said if you can't show someone else exactly what you did and what it produced, you don't actually know what you're doing. You just got lucky. Silas set the pages down. He looked at her across the table, really looked at her, in a way he hadn't quite managed before, like he was seeing the full dimensions of something he'd been only partially registering. I'll leave for Missoula Wednesday morning, he said. Ooh. He was gone for 3 days, not 2. She didn't let herself think about what that meant until the 3rd day, when the light was fading and the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees, and there was still no sign of him on the road coming in from the east. She told herself the roads were poor and the horse needed rest, and any number of practical explanations, all of which were true, and none of which kept her from standing at the kitchen window longer than she needed to while the supper kept warm on the stove. Pruitt didn't say anything, but she caught him glancing toward the road twice during the late afternoon, which told her she wasn't the only one calculating. Silas came back at 7:30 that evening, cold and tired and smelling of 2 days of hard riding. He came in through the back door, hung his coat, and sat down heavily at the kitchen table. She put food in front of him without asking whether he wanted it. He ate for a few minutes before he said anything. The provisioning operation is run by a man named Greer, he said. Emmett Greer. He supplies 3 army posts and 2 mining operations in the territory. He moves more preserved protein in a month than Webb moves in 6. What did he say? He asked a lot of questions. Silas pushed the plate slightly and picked up the coffee she'd left for him. About the process, about the equipment, about how long the product keeps under different storage conditions. He paused. He'd heard of your father's methods. She went still. He had? Not by name, but the technique, the specific smoke blend, and the salt ratio method. He said he'd encountered it before in provisioning work he'd done in Ohio. Said it was the best shelf life yield of anything he'd seen. Silas looked at her. I told him the operation here was run by my wife. He said he'd need to speak with her directly. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked and the wind was at the window, and somewhere outside one of the horses shifted in the barn. He wants to come here, Silas said. When? 10 days. 10 days. 12 days left on the mortgage deadline. The timing was close enough to be uncomfortable and far enough to be survivable, maybe. What's he looking for? She asked. A 6-month supply contract. Minimum delivery of 200 pounds of finished product per month. He set down the coffee. At territory standard provisioning rates, that contract would generate. He quoted me a figure and I wrote it down. He pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket and put it on the table. She looked at the number. For a moment, she didn't say anything. The number was larger than what she'd been calculating in her head. Significantly larger. Because Greer's operation bought at commercial provisioning rates, not at the retail adjacent rate that Webb paid, and commercial volume changed the arithmetic in ways she hadn't fully accounted for. Can we produce 200 pounds a month consistently? Silas asked. Currently, no, she said. The word landed between them with its full weight. She didn't soften it. Our current production capacity is limited by the smokehouse size and the fire pit configuration. 200 pounds a month requires either a longer continuous burn cycle or a second fire pit. A second fire pit. It's a stone construction project. 2 weeks of work, maybe 3. I know exactly what it needs to look like. My father designed a dual pit configuration that he documented in the ledger. The draft management is different, but manageable. 2 weeks, he said. We have 10 days before Greer arrives. I know. If Greer comes and the capacity isn't there, I know, Silas. She wasn't sharp about it, just direct. I'm not going to tell you it's fine when it isn't. We have a gap. The question is whether we can close it partially in 10 days and make the case that full capacity will be in place by the time the first contract delivery is due. He was quiet. She watched him think, and what she was watching was not the calculating exhaustion that had been his baseline expression for most of the fall. There was something else in it now. Not optimism exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that hadn't been there before. Who does the construction? He said. Hogue, she said. He knows stonework. I've watched him. He's better at it than he lets on. Silas made a sound that was almost a short laugh. You're going to ask Hogue. I already did, she said. He stared at her. This morning, before you came back, I asked him if he had the skill to add a second fire pit to the existing structure based on specifications I provided. He looked at the specifications for a while, and then he said he'd need to look at the existing pit first. I took him over there. She paused. He said he could do it in 8 days if he had a second man. Silas sat back in his chair. He had the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of a situation they thought they already understood. You arranged all of this, he said, before I got back. I arranged a conversation, she said carefully. Nothing moves without your authorization. I was trying to have the information ready so we could make a decision tonight instead of losing more time. He looked at the number on the paper again. Then he looked at her. Hogue gets his second man, whatever he needs. She nodded. And Greer, he said, when he comes, he wants to talk to you directly. I know. You're comfortable with that? The question surprised her slightly. The way he asked it, with something that was less managerial and more like he was actually checking, like it mattered to him what the answer was. Yes, she said. It's my operation. I should be the one who talks about it. Something settled in his face. He nodded once, and the nod had a quality to it she hadn't seen before. Not just acknowledgement, but something more like recognition. Us. Hogue worked on the second fire pit with a focus that reminded Eowyn of the way her father used to work. No wasted motion, no conversation that wasn't necessary, just a man and a problem, and the accumulated skill to address it. His second man was a quiet ranch hand named Vasquez, who didn't say much but moved when Hogue said move and lifted when Hogue said lift. And that was apparently all Hogue required of a second man. Eowyn spent those 8 days managing two things simultaneously: the ongoing Smokehouse production and the supervision of the construction, making sure the new pit was positioned correctly relative to the rack system and the draft venting. The dual pit design in her father's ledger was detailed enough to be useful, but had been drawn for a different physical structure, and adapting it to the existing smokehouse required judgment calls she couldn't always make from the page alone. She stood in the smokehouse with the ledger open in one hand and a piece of chalk in the other more than once, working out an adaptation on the interior stone wall before she trusted herself to commit to it. Everett watched all of this with the absorbed attention he'd applied to everything since the beginning. He'd started asking more sophisticated questions, not just how things worked, but why specific design choices had been made, what the trade-offs were, whether different configurations would produce different results. She answered him seriously, because the questions deserved serious answers, and because she'd noticed that when someone asked serious questions, it usually meant they were learning something, and learning was not a thing you interrupted with shortcuts. "If I wanted to learn this properly," he said one afternoon while she was managing a burn and he was maintaining the wood supply. "Not just help, actually learn the process." "You'd need to start with the chemistry," she said. "The salt science first, then the smoke compounds. There are books on it. Not easy to find out here, but they exist." "Your father's ledger." "The ledger documents application. It doesn't teach underlying principles." She adjusted the north vent by a quarter turn. "If the ranch operation expands the way it might need to, we'll need someone who can run a secondary process. That requires actual knowledge, not just following instructions." She wasn't sure at that point whether she was making him a promise or just thinking out loud. But he went quiet in the way he did when he was storing information, and she left it there. The second fire pit was functional on the 8th day, exactly as Hogue had said it would be. He tested it himself before he told her it was ready, burning a small trial fire and watching the draft performance for 2 hours, making 2 adjustments to the vent angles before he was satisfied. Then he came to find her. "It's ready," he said. "Draft runs a little slower than the original because of the shared wall, but that's manageable. You'll need to compensate on the timing." "How much?" "Maybe 10-15 minutes added to a full burn cycle. Hard to say exactly until you run it." "I'll run it tonight," she said. He nodded and started to go. "Hogue." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "You did this in 8 days. That matters." He looked at her with the expression of a man who was not used to being thanked directly and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. "Silas's father built the original," he said finally. "Seemed right to do it proper." He left. She went to start the fire. Emmett Greer arrived on a Thursday morning in a good wagon with a driver and a young assistant who carried a leather satchel and wrote things down. He was a compact, sharp-eyed man in his late 40s who wore his authority lightly in the way that people who genuinely possessed it often did. No performance of importance, no announcement of his own significance, just the direct, evaluating attention of someone who had spent decades making consequential decisions and had gotten reasonably good at it. Silas met him in the yard. Eowyn stood slightly behind and to Silas's left, and she watched Greer's eyes move across the property as he climbed down from the wagon. The same kind of reading she'd done herself on the first day, she realized, cataloging condition and potential simultaneously. He shook Silas's hand. Then he looked at her. "Mrs. Rowan," he said. "Mr. Greer." "I'd like to see the operation before we talk numbers," he said. Not dismissively, just establishing the order of things. "Of course," she said. "Follow me." She took him through the smokehouse herself. Silas walked with them, but she led, because this was what she knew and they all understood it without having to say so. She walked Greer through the restored original structure first, then the new dual pit configuration, explaining the reasoning behind each element, the positioning of the vents, the rack height, the draft management system she'd developed through the first 4 runs. She showed him her father's ledger, opened to the relevant sections, and explained the lineage of the method without sentimentality. This was a system developed over 30 years by a man who understood protein chemistry, and these were its technical principles. And this was how they'd been adapted to the current equipment. Greer listened. He asked precise questions, the kind that told her immediately that he actually understood what she was talking about, that he wasn't processing it at the surface level. When she explained the temperature management approach, he asked about the variance tolerance. When she described the salt cure ratios, he asked whether they'd tested variations for different fat content levels. When she showed him the production records from all 5 runs, including the dual pit trial, he spent 4 minutes reading through them without speaking. Consistent yield improvement across runs, he said, mostly to himself. Learning the equipment, she said. The variance should continue to decrease as the process becomes more predictable. And the 200-pound monthly minimum. He looked up from the records. That's achievable with the dual pit configuration? Comfortably, she said. 200 pounds is approximately 1.5 full production cycles per month at current capacity. We have room above that ceiling. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Silas. Then he looked back at the smokehouse. I want to taste the product, he said. She brought him samples from cold storage, cuts from the 4th run and from the dual pit trial, clearly labeled. She watched him eat the way she'd watched Silas eat the first cut, 3 weeks ago. With attention, not just consumption. His assistant wrote something in the satchel notebook. The trial batch, Greer said, indicating the dual pit sample. The flavor profile is different from the 4th run. Different wood blend in the trial, she said. We had a shortage of the hickory oak mix and substituted a portion with applewood. The flavor is more complex, but the preservation characteristics are equivalent. I prefer it, he said simply. She filed that away. They sat at the kitchen table with Silas afterward, and the assistant opened the satchel and produced a document that was already partially drafted. Greer went through it with the directness of a man who had negotiated many contracts and had no interest in the theatrical version of the process. 6 months, renewable. Minimum 200 pounds per month, paid at territory provisioning rate. Delivery to Greer's Missoula operation by wagon, the cost of transport to be shared 50-50. First delivery due 40 days from signing. 40 days was well beyond the mortgage deadline. Elowen glanced at Silas. He was looking at the contract. His face was careful. The payment schedule, Silas said. Monthly delivery, monthly payment? 30 days net after delivery, Greer said. We need something different, Silas said. He said it evenly, without apology. We need payment for the first delivery within 10 days of signing, not 30 days after delivery. Greer looked at him. The assistant's pen stopped. That's not our standard arrangement, Greer said. I understand that, and I'm not going to waste your time with a story about why. What I'll tell you is that this operation is sound. The product is what you've tasted, and the records are what you've read. If you want the arrangement and you want it built on something solid, I need that first payment advanced. Silence. Greer looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Elowen. If the payment isn't made on time, he said to her directly, what happens to the operation? She understood what he was actually asking. He was asking whether the operation was Silas's risk or hers, whether the knowledge and skill that made the contract worth having would still be present if the financial situation forced some change. The operation runs as long as I run it, she said. That's not contingent on anything else. Greer held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at his assistant and made a small gesture. Adjust the payment terms, he said. First delivery payment within 10 days of signing. Standard terms from the second delivery forward. The assistant wrote. Silas said nothing, but she heard him exhale just slightly through his nose, the specific sound of a man releasing something he has been holding for a very long time. Bad. The contract signing took another 20 minutes. Greer and his assistant were back in their wagon by early afternoon, the document signed in triplicate, one copy with Greer, one with Silas, and one, which Silas handed to her without comment, with Elowen. She stood in the yard after the wagon pulled away and looked at the paper in her hands. The cold was sharp and the sky had gone back to its flat Montana gray, and from behind the grain shed the smokehouse sat quiet in the thin afternoon light, both fire pits cold for now, waiting. Silas stood beside her. He was looking at the road where the wagon had gone. That was well done, he said. What you said to him, about the operation running as long as you run it. It's the truth, she said. I know it is. He paused. A long pause, the kind that had something forming in it. I should have understood that earlier. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was still watching the road, or the space where the road went. When I came back from Missoula, he said, and you'd already spoken to Hogue, already had the plan ready. He stopped, started again. For a minute, I was angry about it, that you'd moved without telling me first. She waited. That was wrong, he said. It wasn't wrong because the plan was bad. It was wrong because I was measuring your authority by different rules than I'd measure my own. If Pruitt had done the same thing, I'd have said good thinking, but because it was you. He stopped again. That was wrong. The wind moved across the yard and she felt it at the back of her neck below the collar of her coat. I know, she said, simply, not an accusation, just the confirmation of something they both already knew. He looked at her then, and for the first time since a stranger had shaken her hand outside a relay office in Caldwell Creek and put her trunk on a wagon without asking if she needed help, she saw something in his face that wasn't exhaustion or calculation or the careful management of a man handling too many problems at once. It was something simpler than all of that, and more uncomfortable for it. She looked away first, not because she was avoiding it, just because there was still work to do, and the smokehouse needed to be prepped for the 5th run, and Everett needed instructions for the morning, and the copy of the contract in her hand needed to be put somewhere safe. She walked back toward the house. Behind her, she heard Silas standing in the yard for another moment before he followed. Greer's payment arrived 8 days after the signing. A bank draft, delivered by a writer from Missoula, addressed to Silas Rowan, Rowan Ranch, Clark Fork Valley. The amount was exactly what the contract specified for the first delivery. Not a penny adjusted, not a day late. Silas held it in both hands in the front room and looked at it for a long moment before he went to find Elowen. She was in the smokehouse running the 5th production cycle, the first one using both fire pits simultaneously. She'd been at it since 4 in the morning. When Silas appeared in the doorway, she was crouched near the secondary pit, adjusting the lower vent with the careful, incremental movements she used when the fire was at a critical stage and overcorrecting would cost her more than doing nothing. He waited until she stood up. The payment came, he said. She straightened dusted ash from her hands. How much time do we have before the mortgage deadline? 4 days. She nodded. Enough. Enough, he agreed. He held out the draft. She looked at it but didn't take it. Her hands were dirty and it was a bank document, and that seemed like the wrong combination. Does it cover the full required payment? She asked. With $31 left over. $31 wasn't a buffer. It was barely a breath. But it was on the right side of zero, which was the only side that mattered right now. You should ride to Helena tomorrow, she said. Don't send it. Deliver it yourself and get the receipt in hand. He looked at her. I was planning to. Good. She turned back to the fire pit. He stood in the doorway for another moment. The dual pit run, he said. How's it going? Ask me in 14 hours, she said, which was the same thing she'd said during the first run, and he recognized it, and she heard something in his exhale that might have been the beginning of a real laugh. Short, quiet, not quite completed, but there. He left. She went back to the fire. He made it to Helena and back in 3 days. Pruitt ran the ranch in his absence with the steady competence of a man who had been doing it in various degrees for 2 decades. Elowen ran the smokehouse. The 5th run finished on the morning of the 2nd day, and she pulled the product off the racks herself, working slowly in the cold interior of the building, assessing each cut with the practiced attention that was becoming, run by run, something closer to instinct than technique. The dual pit output was 211 pounds of finished product. She wrote the number in her record book and stood looking at it for a moment. 211. 11 above the contract minimum from a first attempt at the new configuration. The timing compensation Hogue had warned her about, the additional 15 minutes on the burn cycle for the secondary pit, had worked exactly as he'd predicted, once she'd found the right adjustment point. She'd found it on the 3rd hour of the 2nd pit cycle, made the change, and watched the smoke from that vent go from slightly pale to the steady blue-gray that meant the temperature had settled where she needed it. She wrote next to the number, timing compensation confirmed, secondary pit reliable, Dual pit production sustainable. Then she put the record book in her coat pocket and went to start the wrapping process. Everett was already there when she got to the storage area, having apparently decided, again, that this was where he needed to be without being asked. He'd become quietly indispensable in the way that certain people did. Not through dramatic moments, but through the steady accumulation of showing up, of paying attention, of doing the next necessary thing without requiring direction. She'd started catching herself planning around his presence without thinking about it, which was both useful and slightly dangerous because he was a ranch hand with other obligations, and she shouldn't build a system that depended on his discretionary time. She mentioned this to him, obliquely, while they were wrapping the product from the 5th run. "Pruitt's asked me about my hours," Everett said. Not defensive, just factual. "What did you tell him?" "That I was learning something useful." He paused. He didn't argue with that. "Did he ask what you were learning?" "He said he could see what I was learning. He said that was fine as long as my regular work was covered." Everett looked up from the cut he was wrapping. "Is it a problem, me being here?" "No," she said. "I'm trying to make sure you're not building your time around this operation in a way that creates problems for you later." "What kind of problems later?" She wasn't sure how to say this without it sounding like more than she meant it to. "This operation is currently my responsibility. If the circumstances of the ranch change, so might the operation. I don't want you to have arranged your understanding of your future around something that may not be permanent." He considered this. He had the quality, she'd noticed, of taking what people said seriously rather than just hearing the surface of it. "Are you thinking of leaving?" he asked. The question was direct enough that it caught her slightly off guard. "I haven't thought about it in those terms," she said, which was honest. "Because the operation needs you," he said, "and not just because of the contract." She looked at him. "The men," he said. "The ranch. It's different than it was in October. You know that, right? It's not just the money." He went back to the wrapping. "I'm not saying this to... I just think you should know that it's different. That you changed something, not the smokehouse. You." She didn't say anything for a moment. She kept working. "Keep learning the chemistry," she finally said. "I'll find you the books." Silas came back from Helena on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a receipt from the Territorial Savings Association acknowledging full payment of the overdue mortgage amount and suspension of foreclosure proceedings. He put it on the kitchen table when he came in, still in his riding coat, and sat down heavily and looked at it like a man looking at something he hadn't entirely believed would exist. Elwyn put coffee in front of him and sat across the table. "There's still the January equipment note," he said. "I know." "And the feed merchant in Deer Lodge." "I know that too. The Greer contract covers the January note if we make the first delivery on schedule, and the second payment comes in time." He was working through it as he said it, the same way he always worked through financial information, out loud, methodically, like he was checking his own arithmetic by speaking it. "The feed merchant is smaller. If I go to him directly, explain the situation, show him the contract, he'll wait," she said. "If you go in person with something concrete to show him, he'll wait. Merchants in Deer Lodge aren't running a charity, but they're also not running against a man who's clearly turning a corner. It costs them more to pursue the debt than to give you another 60 days. He looked at her. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about all of it," she said, "for weeks." He turned the receipt over in his hands. It was a piece of paper. That was all it was. But it represented the difference between something continuing and something ending, and both of them knew the weight of that. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "The ledger," he said, "your father's. How much of what you know is in that ledger, and how much is in you?" She thought about this seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "The ledger is documentation," she said. "It records what he did and how he did it, but documentation isn't knowledge. You can hand someone a recipe and they can follow every instruction exactly and still make something that isn't right, because the recipe can't tell you what the smoke looks like when the temperature is running 2 degrees high, or what the surface of the meat feels like when the salt cure has gone the right depth. Those things," she paused, "those live in your hands and your eyes. You learn them by doing, not by reading. And you did the doing." "Since I was 12. First as his assistant, then as his equal, then alone after he couldn't anymore." He was quiet for a moment. The receipt sat on the table between them. "What was wrong with him?" he said. not intrusively, just asking the thing he hadn't asked before. His lungs, she said. The smoke exposure over 30 years. It wasn't acute. He didn't get suddenly sick. It was slow. He worked as long as he could. By the end, he could give instruction, but he couldn't be in the building. She looked at her own hands. The last 2 years were mine. He told me what to do, I did it, and I came back out and reported what I'd observed, and he told me what it meant. That's how I learned the last of it, by being his eyes and hands when his wouldn't work anymore. Silas said nothing for a moment. I'm sorry, he said. She looked up. He stopped. That's a hard way to learn something, and a hard way to lose someone. Yes, she said, simply. It was both of those things, and there was no point in diminishing it. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the afternoon light had gone orange and low across the valley, the short December light that made everything look more temporary than it was. He would have liked this, she said, before she'd decided to say it. The setup, the dual pits, the Greer contract. She turned her coffee cup slightly on the table. He spent years trying to get commercial provisioning operations interested in the method. Most of them thought it was too labor-intensive compared to simple salt pack preservation. He never got the contract. He just kept doing the work because he believed in it. And you kept doing it after him. Someone had to. He looked at her. That's not why, he said. Not just because someone had to. She didn't answer that, but she didn't deny it either. The weeks that followed had a different rhythm than the ones before. Not easier, exactly. The work didn't decrease, and there were still days when the smokehouse demanded more than she felt she had, and mornings when she was up before anyone else, and going long after everyone had gone to bed. But the quality of the exhaustion had changed. Before, it had been the kind that felt like running toward a wall you might not stop in time. Now it felt like the kind that came from building something, which was still tiring but carried its weight differently. The men had stopped being neutral about her. She didn't register exactly when the shift completed. It was gradual, like the shift in the air quality she'd noticed back in November, impossible to pinpoint to a specific day. But at some point she realized that when she walked across the yard, the men she passed said good morning in a way that meant it. That when she came to the bunkhouse to discuss supply logistics with Pruitt, the conversation in the room didn't shift in quiet in the cautious way it had in the first weeks. That Hogue, who had never in her presence been anything other than functional and correct, had started leaving small things outside the smokehouse door. A coil of extra rope she'd needed, a replacement wooden wedge for a vent adjustment mechanism, without ever mentioning it. She didn't say anything about any of this to Silas. It didn't need to be said. What she did say to Silas on an evening in the second week of December when they were both at the kitchen table, him with the financial records he'd been reorganizing since the Helena trip, her with her production planning notebook, was something she'd been working out for several days. The Greer contract runs 6 months, she said. Renewable, he said. Assuming he renews and assuming the operation maintains current output, the annual income from that contract alone covers the mortgage, the equipment notes, and leaves a margin for raw stock investment. She had the numbers in front of her. But the contract is built around a single operation in a single building. He looked up from his papers. If we wanted to grow this beyond one smokehouse, she said, we would need to think about it soon. The infrastructure takes time, and the supply relationships take longer. Grow it how? There are 2 abandoned structures on the north section of the property. I looked at them last week. One is a stone building that could be adapted. It's smaller than the main smokehouse, but the construction is similar. The other needs more work, but has better dimensions. She showed him the notes she'd made. A second smokehouse on the north section could add another 150 pounds of monthly capacity. With that, we could accommodate a second commercial buyer at the same contract level as Greer. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. You've been out to the north section, he said. Multiple times. Hogue came with me on the last visit. She paused. He thinks the stone building can be made operational in 3 weeks. Less than the main smokehouse took, because we're not starting completely from scratch. You've already talked to Hogue about this. She held his gaze. This time she didn't add the careful qualification about not having given orders. She just let him sit with it. He looked at her for a moment, then he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not a large one. It was small and crooked and had some tiredness at the edge of it. But it was genuine, and it was directed at her, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I'm not going to argue about Hogue," he said. "Good," she said. "What does a second operation cost to start?" She turned to the relevant page in her notebook. They worked through the numbers together, both of them at the table, her ledger and his financial records and her notebook all spread between them in the lamplight. It took 2 hours. She corrected 2 of his calculations, and he corrected one assumption in her supply cost estimate, and neither of them made a particular event of either correction. They just kept working. At some point, Pruitt knocked on the back door about something unrelated to either of them, a question about the next day's work schedule. Silas answered it, and Elowin went back to the numbers, and when Silas came back to the table, he sat down and picked up exactly where he'd left off without any gap or reset. Like 2 people who had been doing this for years rather than 2 people who had met 43 days ago outside a relay office in the cold. Pruitt, she suspected, had seen enough through the back door window to have drawn his own conclusions. She suspected he'd been drawing conclusions for a while. The letter from the Territorial Provisioning Office arrived on a Friday in the 3rd week of December. She didn't know it was significant when Everett brought it in from the mail run. It was addressed to Silas Rowan, ranch business. Nothing unusual about the envelope. She put it with the other correspondence on the desk in the front room and went back to the smokehouse. Silas opened it that evening. He read it twice. Then he came to find her, which was becoming his habit when something required another set of eyes on it. She was at the kitchen table with her father's ledger open, working through a recipe adjustment for the applewood blend that Greer had specifically said he preferred. She closed the ledger when she saw his face. "What is it?" she said. He put the letter on the table. She read it. It was from an office in Helena, the Territorial Provisioning and Supply Inspection Bureau, which she had not previously heard of. It stated that the Bureau had received notice of a new smoke curing operation in the Clark Fork Valley, and that a field inspector would be visiting the Rowan Ranch in the 1st week of January to assess the operation for potential inclusion on the Bureau's approved supplier register. The approved supplier register, the letter explained in its careful bureaucratic language, was the list from which territorial government purchasing agents drew their primary supply contracts for military posts, government camps, and public works operations throughout the Montana Territory. She looked up from the letter. "Who notified them?" she said. "I don't know," Silas said, then after a pause, "Greer, probably. Greer, who supplied 3 army posts, who had heard of her father's methods before he'd ever walked onto this property, who had asked, during his visit, questions that went beyond what a single 6-month contract would require. The approved supplier register," she said. "If we're on it," Silas said carefully, "we're not selling to one buyer or 2. We're accessible to every government purchasing agent in the territory." The kitchen was very quiet. "The inspector comes in the 1st week of January," she said. "January 4th, if we're available. That's what the letter says." She calculated. The North Section Smokehouse, the one she and Hogue had been planning, would not be operational by January 4th. The main smokehouse would be, and would have 6 completed production runs behind it by then. The records would show consistent output and improving yield. The dual pit configuration would be fully functional and demonstrable. It was not ideal. Ideal would have been another 2 months of production data and the North Section operation already running. But she had learned in 43 days on this ranch that ideal was not generally on offer. What was on offer was what you had, and the question was always whether what you had was enough. She thought about the smokehouse behind the grain shed, the one she'd found on a November afternoon, half buried under a decade of climbing shrub. The stone walls that had absorbed 30 years of wood smoke and preserved it in waiting. The intact rack. The draft vents cut with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She thought about her father, sitting at a workbench in fading light, writing in the ledger that she'd carried across the frontier in a canvas satchel. Writing down everything he knew, not because he expected anyone to publish it or honor it, but because he believed the knowledge was worth preserving. She put the letter down on the table. "Tell the inspector January 4th is convenient," she said. Silas looked at her for a moment. "You're sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "Set a fire in the North Section building to take the freeze out of the stone. It won't be operational in time, but a warm building looks more like a working building than a cold one." She picked up her father's ledger. "And I need to organize the full production record into something a government inspector can read at a single sitting." She got up from the table. She had approximately 2.5 weeks, and 2.5 weeks was not very much time, and she knew that, and it didn't change the answer. What it changed was what the next 2.5 weeks looked like. She went to get her notebook. The 2.5 weeks before the inspector's arrival were the most compressed of everything that had come before them, not because they were more difficult than October had been, or more uncertain than the first burn, or more pressured than the days before Greer's visit. They were all of those things in combination, which was its own category of hard. Elowyn worked through the Christmas week without marking it particularly. There was food on the table, and the men had an easier day on the 25th, which was more than some of them had expected, and that was sufficient. She spent the holiday evening reorganizing the full production record into a clean, sequential document that a government inspector could read without needing her to explain it, which was the only kind of document worth handing to a government inspector. Silas helped with this, which she hadn't expected. He came to the kitchen table on the evening of the 26th with his own handwriting and his own understanding of what official documentation needed to look like. He'd dealt with territorial offices before, land surveys and grazing permits, and the mortgage correspondence. And he sat down and read through what she'd assembled and made suggestions without making them into demands. He caught 2 places where the date sequencing could be misread, and one place where her technical language, while accurate, would likely land as opaque on someone who wasn't already familiar with the curing process. "Write it like you're explaining it to Silas Rowan in October," he said, which surprised her into a short laugh. "Silas Rowan in October didn't know anything about this," she said. "Exactly," he said. "Write it for him." She rewrote those sections. He was right that they were clear afterward, and she didn't pretend otherwise. Hogue worked on the north section building through the Christmas week alongside Vasquez and a third man named Cully, who turned out to have more stone experience than anyone had known about because no one had specifically asked. Cully was a quiet man in his late 30s who had worked in mine construction in Colorado before coming north, and he had the particular relationship with stone and mortar that came from years of working with both under conditions where getting it wrong had serious consequences. With him added to the crew, Hogue revised his timeline. 10 days instead of 3 weeks, Hogue told Elowyn on the 27th, in the blunt way he told her everything. "The inspector comes January 4th, she said. "I know when the inspector comes." "Will the building be ready to show?" He considered this with the careful honesty she'd come to rely on from him. "The secondary pit won't be finished. The rack will be installed and the venting will be functional. You could run a fire in it." "Could I run a production burn in it?" "No, but I could demonstrate a controlled fire and show the draft management." He thought about this. "Yes. With me running the second vent manually, yes." "That's enough," she said. He looked at her in the measuring way he had. "You're going to show him a half-finished building and tell him it's an expansion." "I'm going to show him a half-finished building and show him what it's becoming," she said. "That's different." He made the sound he made when he didn't disagree but wasn't going to say so. Then he went back to work. The 6th production run from the main Smokehouse finished on January 2nd, 2 days before the inspector arrived, and the timing was not accidental. She'd planned the run to finish then, so the product would be fully cooled and properly stored and presentable, and so the building itself would have 2 days to air and settle before someone walked into it for an official evaluation. She'd learned from her father that a smokehouse smelled most intensely in the 24 hours after a run, and then settled into the deeper, older smell that was the building's permanent character. The deeper smell was more impressive, in her experience, to people who didn't know the process well. It smelled like history, like something serious had been happening here for a long time. The 6th run produced 219 pounds, 8 above the 5th run's output. She wrote the number down and looked at the full record. 6 runs. An arc of improving yield with one controlled anomaly, the 3rd run, which had been slightly under the 4th due to a raw material inconsistency from Torvald's operation, a variation in the fat content of one batch of hogs that she'd noted and accounted for in subsequent purchases. The record told the story of a process that had started competent and become reliable. That was what she needed it to tell, and it told it because it was true, not because she'd arranged it to look that way. She slept 6 hours on the night of January 2nd, which was more sleep than she'd gotten in a single stretch since November. The territorial provisioning inspector's name was Arthur Holt. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s, with the precise, unhurried manner of someone who had been taught to assess things carefully and had internalized the lesson. He came with one assistant, a woman named Claire, who also wrote things down, and he drove his own wagon from the Helena office rather than taking a hired driver, which Elowen noted as a detail that told her something about him. Silas met him in the yard. Elowen stood at Silas's left shoulder. Holt shook Silas's hand, then looked at Elowen with the direct assessment of someone who had read a file before arriving. "Mrs. Rowan," he said, "I understand the operation is yours." "My husband owns the ranch," she said. "The Smokehouse operation is mine." It was the clearest she'd stated it to anyone outside the immediate ranch, and she'd chosen to state it that way deliberately. Not to diminish Silas. She glanced at him when she said it, and he gave her a small nod that said he understood. But because clarity about who ran what was more valuable to everyone in this conversation than politeness. Holt nodded. "Then I'd like you to walk me through it, if you will." She took him through the main smokehouse first, the same way she'd taken Greer through it, but differently. Greer had been a buyer evaluating a product. Holt was an assessor evaluating a system. He asked different kinds of questions. He wanted to know about contamination prevention at each stage of the process. He wanted to know about the water source for the brine preparation and the distance between it and the fire pits. He asked about temperature monitoring precision, which led to an extended conversation about the limitations of working without thermometric equipment and how she compensated through observation and adjustment. "Your father developed this visual temperature assessment methodology?" he asked when she'd explained it. "He documented it," she said. "He'd say he didn't develop it. He'd say he refined what previous practitioners had established and wrote down what they'd only passed on verbally. He was particular about that distinction." Holt looked at the ledger she'd brought. She'd offered it to him at the beginning without being asked. He'd been carrying it through the tour, referring to it at intervals. "This documentation is quite thorough," he said. "My father believed that knowledge kept only in one person's head was one illness away from being lost," she said. Holt looked up from the ledger. "That's a practical philosophy." He was a practical man. They moved to the north section building. She watched Holt take in the half-finished state of the interior with the unreadable expression of a man calibrating what he was seeing against whatever he'd anticipated. His assistant wrote. He walked the perimeter of the space, looked at the installed rack, crouched to examine the primary pit that was finished, looked at the secondary pit that was not. "Completion timeline?" he said. "The primary pit and venting are functional now," she said. "The secondary pit, but 2 weeks. The building will be at full production capacity by the end of January." "Demonstrable today?" "The primary pit, yes." She looked at Hogue, who was standing just inside the door. He met her eyes and moved to the secondary vent without being asked. She lit the primary pit fire herself from materials she'd had staged and ready since the morning, and spent the next 40 minutes managing the initial burn while Holt watched and asked questions and his assistant wrote, and Hogue ran the secondary vent with the precise, economical adjustments of someone who had spent enough time in this building to understand what it needed. It wasn't a production burn. It wasn't meant to be. It was a demonstration of a controlled process, and that was what it demonstrated. Draft management, temperature build, the visual indicators she used at each stage. She narrated as she worked, not performing but explaining, because there was a difference and she knew which one was appropriate here. At some point, she became aware that Silas was standing in the doorway behind Holt. She didn't know how long he'd been there. He wasn't saying anything, he was watching. She didn't look at him for long. She had a fire to manage. Holt and his assistant took the midday meal at the ranch house. Elowen had prepared it herself. Not elaborately, there wasn't time for elaborate, but the cured product from the 6th run appeared in a form that let it speak plainly for itself, alongside the cornbread and the winter root vegetables, and the coffee that was better than most of what you found on a frontier ranch because she'd made that an early priority. Holt ate with attention. His assistant ate with more obvious enthusiasm, which Elowen suspected was the more reliable signal. After the meal, Holt asked to see the production records. She put the organized document in front of him and he read it with the same unhurried precision he'd brought to everything else. She sat across from him. Silas sat at the end of the table, not interjecting, present but not central, which was the correct configuration for this particular conversation, and they both knew it. Holt asked 3 questions about the production records. 2 were clarifying questions about methodology. One was about the raw material sourcing, where the livestock came from, whether there was a consistent supplier, what the quality variance had been. She answered all three completely. Then he put the document down and looked at her directly. The Bureau's approved supplier register has 23 operations currently listed in the Montana Territory, he said. Of those, 4 produce smoke-cured protein. None of them use a methodology comparable to what I've observed here, and none of their production records show the yield consistency this document represents at a comparable stage of operation. The kitchen was very quiet. The listing process has a review period, he continued, typically 60 days from inspection report to formal approval. During that period, the Bureau may request additional documentation or a follow-up visit. He paused. In this case, I don't anticipate needing either. She held his gaze steadily. What does listing on the register mean in practical terms for this operation? It means territorial purchasing agents can contract directly with you. Military posts, government camps, public works operations. They draw from the register rather than sourcing independently, so listing means access to a buyer pool that currently has no adequate supplier for this specific product category. He picked up his coffee. Demand will exceed your current capacity within the first month of listing. Silence. She thought about the North Section building. 2 weeks to finish. Full production capacity by end of January. If the listing approval came through in 60 days, early March, the North Section would be operational and running. Combined capacity at full output, somewhere above 350 pounds per month. It still might not be enough. She thought about the south-facing slope on the upper property where there were 2 further structures she hadn't yet fully evaluated. She thought about Everett asking questions about chemistry with the focused attention of someone who was learning something rather than just performing interest. She thought about Hogue at the secondary vent this morning, adjusting with the instinctive precision of a man who had absorbed a process through consistent exposure. She thought about her father's ledger, the knowledge in it, 30 years of careful documentation, designed to be used, not preserved. I'll need to expand the operation, she said, to meet that demand. That would be the expectation, Holt said. I'd need to be clear with the Bureau about the timeline. I won't commit to a delivery volume I can't meet. If the listing happens in March and demand comes immediately, I need to know what the Bureau's position is on a phased capacity build. Holt looked at her for a moment. She had the sense he was recalibrating something, that she had said something he hadn't expected to hear from this particular type of meeting, in this type of place. The Bureau prefers an honest capacity assessment over an optimistic one that results in a failed contract, he said. Submit a phased production schedule with your listing application. We'll review it. I'll have it to you within 2 weeks, she said. He nodded, closed his folder, looked at Silas and then back at her. Mrs. Rowan, he said with the particular tone of someone who has assessed a thing and arrived at a firm conclusion, I'll have my report filed by the end of this week. After Holt and his assistant left, the yard was quiet. In the way it went quiet after something significant had happened. Not peaceful, exactly, but a different quality of silence than ordinary silence. Elowen stood on the porch for a moment and watched the wagon diminish down the road east. Silas came and stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. Demand will exceed your current capacity within the first month, he said, finally, quoting Holt's words back. I know. The South Slope structures. I looked at them last week. The larger one needs more work than the North Section building, but the dimensions are better, say, bigger interior, which means a larger rack capacity. The smaller one is in worse shape, but the stone is sound. He was quiet. How many people does it take to run 3 smokehouse operations simultaneously? More than I have, she said. I'd need to train people properly, not just to assist, to run processes independently. She paused. Everett can run the main smokehouse by next spring if I teach him consistently between now and then. He already understands more than he knows he understands. And the others? Hogue knows the construction and the maintenance. If I teach him the process itself, he can manage the North Section operation. She turned the calculations over as she spoke. Vasquez and Cully, they're fast learners, and they don't cut corners. With Hogue supervising construction on the South Slope buildings, they could have them operational by April. Silas turned to look at her. You've already planned all of this. I've been thinking about it for several weeks, she said, which wasn't quite the same thing, but wasn't different enough to argue about. He looked at her for a long moment. The January light was cold and flat and honest, the kind of light that didn't do anyone any favors, but also didn't hide anything. "Come inside," he said. "There's something I need to talk to you about." What? He had papers on the desk in the front room when she came in. Not the financial correspondence, different papers, official-looking, with a different seal on the top. He stood behind the desk rather than sitting, which was unusual. He had the manner of a man who had prepared what he was going to say and was now being careful to actually say it, rather than the version he'd said in his head. "When I came back from Helena with the mortgage receipt," he started, "I told myself the crisis was over. The immediate one, anyway." He looked down at the papers, then back up. "But I've been thinking about what Holt said today, about demand, about what this operation could become." She waited. "I've also been thinking about what I said to you on the day Greer signed the contract." He paused. "About moving without telling me first, about measuring your authority by different rules." "You don't need to revisit that," she said. "I do," he said. "Not because you need to hear it again, because I need to say the next part." She went quiet. He picked up the papers from the desk and held them out to her. She took them. They were legal documents. She scanned them and then read them more slowly, because the language was specific and formal, and she wanted to make sure she was reading it correctly. A deed amendment. The Rowan Ranch property, the Smokehouse operations, all associated structures and equipment, listed as jointly owned by Silas Rowan and Elowen Ashcroft Rowan in equal shares, with equal legal authority over operational decisions. She looked up. "I had it drawn up in Helena," he said, "while I was there for the mortgage payment. I wasn't sure I was going to. I wasn't sure it was the right thing. Then Holt came today, and I listened to you talk about the operation, the expansion plan, the phased capacity schedule, all of it." He stopped. "You didn't build this for me. You built it because it was what the situation needed and you knew how. And I've been signing my name to the results of your work and calling it my ranch." He looked at the papers in her hands. "That's not right. And it needs to not be right in a legal sense, not just in a personal one." She stood with the papers in her hands for a moment that stretched. "Silas," she said. "You don't have to say anything about it now," he said, a little faster than usual. "Take the time to read it properly. If the language isn't—" "The language is fine," she said. She'd read enough of it to know what it said. "I just—" She stopped. She was not someone who was frequently at a loss for the next sentence, and standing here being at a loss for it felt strange and exposed. "I came here with nothing," she said. "A trunk and a satchel and a ledger." "I know," he said. "I wasn't expecting—" She stopped again. "I know that too," he said, quietly, without pressure, just letting her be where she was. She looked at the documents, at the names on them. Then she looked at him, and he looked back at her with the uncomplicated steadiness of someone who had made a decision he was at peace with. And that steadiness was, she found, harder to stand in the face of than any argument would have been. "All right," she said. He nodded. "I'll need a pen," she said. He had one on the desk. He handed it to her. She signed where the document indicated, her signature next to his, and then she put the pen down and folded the papers and put them in her coat pocket, next to her notebook, next to the copy of the Greer contract she still carried. Neither of them made a large moment of it. That felt correct. The North Section Smokehouse reached full operational capacity on the 21st of January, 17 days after Holt's visit. Hogue ran the first production burn himself, with Elowen present for the first 4 hours to monitor and consult, and then not present for the final 14 because she had the main smokehouse running simultaneously, and she trusted him. He'd earned that trust slowly and completely, in the way that the most reliable kind of trust gets built. The Bureau's formal approval letter arrived on March 8th, 4 days ahead of the 60-day window Holt had quoted. The letter listed Rowan Ranch Smokehouse operations on the approved supplier register and acknowledged the phased production schedule she'd submitted. It was signed by a bureau director in Helena, whose name she didn't recognize, in the careful bureaucratic language of official correspondence, and it contained no poetry and no particular warmth. She read it twice and put it in the desk in the front room, in the drawer where the important documents lived. Then she went out to tell the men. She did it in the yard at midday, when the maximum number of people were likely to be in the vicinity. She didn't gather them formally. She just went outside and said, loud enough to carry, that the ranch was now on the territorial government's approved supplier list. There was a pause. Then Everett made a sound that was not quite a shout, but was in that direction, and two of the other younger hands echoed something similar, and even Hogue, standing at the edge of the group with his arms folded and his usual expression of minimal display, uncrossed his arms and gave a single nod that, from him, was the rough equivalent of a standing ovation. Pruitt shook her hand. He said, "Well done," in the direct, unadorned way he said things that he meant, and she understood that from Dale Pruitt that was not a small thing. Silas was standing slightly behind the group. He was watching her, and when she caught his eye, he gave her the same small, crooked smile he'd given her in the kitchen in December, the one she'd been careful not to read too much into at the time. She was a little less careful about it now, so. By April, the South Slope's larger building was operational. The smaller one came online in late May, running a lighter production rotation that supplemented the primary operations during the high-demand spring months when provisioning agents were restocking for summer field operations. The work was never easy. She didn't want to overstate that. There were runs that didn't go the way they should have, raw material inconsistencies that required adjustment mid-process, one catastrophic overcorrection on a temperature management that cost her a partial batch, and a day of her own sharp self-criticism. Everett made his own share of errors learning the main smokehouse operation. Nothing that compromised product quality, but enough that she had to resist the impulse to take over rather than let him work through the problem. Which she did resist, because taking over would have taught him nothing. Some things between her and Silas remained complicated, the way things between two people who came to each other as strangers tend to remain complicated long after they've stopped being strangers. They disagreed about money more than once. He was slower than she was to commit revenue to expansion investment, and she was less patient than he was with the pace of things that required waiting. They learned slowly when to push and when to let the other person get there on their own, and they did not always calibrate this correctly. And there were evenings at the kitchen table that ended with one or both of them going to bed still carrying something unresolved. What they were building wasn't a story about two people who fit together perfectly. It was a story about two people who chose, consistently, to keep working on something difficult because the thing they were building was worth the difficulty. That was a different kind of thing, and in her experience it was the more durable kind. Her father had told her once, in the last year of his life when he was giving instruction through a closed smokehouse door because he couldn't be inside anymore, that the hardest part of any skilled work wasn't learning the technique. The technique could be learned. The hardest part was learning to trust your own judgment when you were operating without the safety net of someone more experienced standing behind you. She'd been thinking about that a lot in the months since October, about what it meant to operate without a safety net, about the particular kind of courage required not to wait for permission before doing the thing that needed doing, and the particular kind of wisdom required to know when to act alone and when to bring someone with you. She didn't have a clean answer for where that line was. She suspected there wasn't one, that the line moved depending on the situation and the people and the stakes involved, and that the best you could do was stay honest about where you'd drawn it and correct when you drew it wrong. She was still learning that. She expected she'd be learning it for a long time. The smokehouse behind the grain shed never stopped running. Through the spring and into the summer of the following year, through weather that was sometimes cooperative and often wasn't, through supply fluctuations and buyer negotiations, and the particular chaos of building something from almost nothing in a territory that did not particularly reward sentiment, the stone building that she'd found half buried under a decade of neglect kept putting up its steady column of pale smoke into the Montana sky. She walked past it most mornings on her way to check the north section operation, and most mornings she didn't stop. There was work to do, and the work didn't pause for reflection. But sometimes, on the mornings when the light was a particular angle, and the smoke was running clean and even, and the cold air carried the wood smoke smell of hickory and apple far enough that you could catch it halfway across the yard, sometimes she stopped and looked at it for a moment. Not with sentimentality. She wasn't built for sentimentality, and she knew it. Just with the quiet, practical recognition of what a thing was, what it had been, what it had become, what it had made possible. Her father had told her the knowledge was worth preserving. He'd been right about that. But what she'd learned, what the Clark Fork Valley winter, and a failing ranch, and an exhausted man's willingness to hear her had taught her, was that knowledge by itself wasn't the whole of it. Knowledge was the beginning. The harder thing, the thing that required more than what any ledger could hold, was the willingness to carry it somewhere it was needed and put it to work. She turned away from the smokehouse and kept walking. There was a 6th production cycle starting in the north section today, and Everett needed to run the first 2 hours solo as part of his training, and Hogue had questions about the draft configuration on the South Slope building's smaller pit, and Silas was waiting for her assessment of the spring contract renewal terms that Greer had sent over last week. The work was waiting. She went to meet it,